Thank you. Thanks for having me. So what I think I'll focus on today, given the nature of this meeting, is the role language plays in othering. I'm going to look at that through the lens of dehumanization particularly, but a lot of what I'm saying applies to all types of social biases. And these are the wonderful people who helped me do the research that I'll talk about today. So if you look at human beings, we are a particularly murderous species. It generalizes to most primates, but essentially what you're seeing here is a map of the animal kingdom, a representation of it, and the hotter colors are species where you have killing just for the sake of killing. And what you notice is that human beings are the red line sort of right there near the top. What's also depicted here is our murder rates over time. So if you go back through human history, this isn't a recent phenomenon. This seems to be a characteristic of our species. And so one of the things that we try to understand in my work is, why is this the case? Why is it the case that as a species we engage in so much intra-species violence when it seems to be a fairly rare occurrence across the animal kingdom? One way that we've gotten some insight is by looking at the brain and the different networks involved in different types of social behaviors. Specifically, we tend to focus on what we call the default mode network, the regions highlighted in blue, which are all neocortical regions, meaning that they are more recently evolved. They're brain regions that we don't share with members of other species. And what we've documented over the last couple of decades are cases where these particular set of regions fail to engage. Now, these regions are critical for understanding other people, for getting inside people's heads, for feeling empathic responses, the kinds of things we tend to associate with prosocial behavior. Yet, in my lab and in many others, we find a number of contexts where people fail to engage these brain regions while interacting with other human beings. And so we've called this dehumanized perception. We think it's a biological mechanism that explains the worst type of human behavior. And so these days we're trying to understand, how is it that people communicate information about others that may drive this kind of brain processing, that may allow us to switch off the parts of our brain necessary to feel empathy, compassion, and other prosocial types of emotions and behaviors. In our very early research, we noticed that we could detect this behavior in language. So what I'm showing you here are data from when people describe a day in the life of a homeless person. Homeless people tend to be dehumanized targets in most societies. And what you find is that there are a particular category of verbs called mental state verbs, like wish, want, hope, dream, desire, that people fail to use as much when simply talking about these types of people. So we're able to detect in language the presence of this mechanism. The question for us then is, can we engineer language that will drive this mechanism? And similarly, can language sort of rehumanize as well, get us to switch this mechanism back on? The first place we thought about looking was in propaganda. So this is data under your right from sociologist Anthony Oberschall, who worked at the ICTY, the Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And he content analyzed a number of propaganda speeches from famous propagandists in Serbia, and essentially what he's documented is the frequency of different themes that occur in these speeches. And I've shown you some examples of these different themes occurring. Two interesting things pop out from the analysis. First is that there's a variety of themes propagandists use to drive behavior to motivate violence, but also the sort of blatant dehumanizing language isn't as frequent as you might expect. So most of us, when we think of dehumanization, we think about the name calling, right? Likening people to objects or animals. That's certainly present, but it isn't dominating in the way we might have expected. And in fact, when we look at sort of behavioral studies where we try to predict things like empathy, dehumanization isn't the strongest predictor. It's certainly not the only predictor. Again, this more blatant form of dehumanization. If we look at physiological studies where we measure people's moral, emotional responses upon hearing these speeches, again, the dehumanizing language isn't particularly driving it. So we've been obsessed with this sort of blatant form of dehumanization, but it doesn't seem to be doing a lot of the work. In fact, what we think might be doing a lot of the work are more subtle ways of dehumanizing, like we detected in that sort of mental state verbs study I mentioned at the beginning. In a separate study, we manipulated the kind of ways we communicated about people who had done different types of harm. And what we manipulated was whether we use personality or trait language to talk about those people, the currency of traditional social exchanges, or whether we describe them in very biological, mechanized ways. And what we tended to find is that the mechanistic descriptions reduced the responsibility of participants attributed to these people for their harms. It also reduced how willing they were to punish them for these harms. And this wasn't just a behavioral phenomenon. If we looked in the brain at the regions that are supposed to guide logical reasoning, these regions were again less engaged by this more mechanistic type of language. And so our thinking began to suggest that it were these more subtle forms of dehumanization that really were driving the kinds of human atrocities we saw. Now, people often tell us, well, these are students at a university. It may not generalize to the real world. In fact, it actually does. You get very similar effects with federal court judges in the United States, where again, you see that the more mechanistic language affects the kinds of responsibility and punishment decisions that they're willing to make. So what we've discovered is that these very subtle cues really have a huge impact on how we other people. One more recent study we did was one where we simply shifted when we mentioned the human beings in the context of organizations doing good and bad things. What we find is that if we mention the organization first, then people focus on the organization, and again, you get this mitigating effect where particularly for bad behavior, we don't hold the organization as responsible. If we simply switch the ordering and we mention the people first that comprise the organization, you reverse the effect. And suddenly people are more focused on those individuals. You get sort of more endorsement of responsibility for bad action. It also affects other variables like control and agency as well. Now, I think the last thing I'll end on is that these linguistic effects tend to naturally occur. It seems like we have these biases baked in to how our brain functions when we think about and communicate about other people. So in a very recent study, we discovered something we call a like me bias, where if you show participants pictures like you see at the top in panel A and you say complete the sentence, X is shouting at Y, and you tell them who X is and who Y is, you give them names, and you simply look at who they choose to mention first. What you find is that people are always mentioning the people similar to them first. So women mention the woman first, men mention the man first. This phenomena generalizes across different types of sentences, as we show here across 3 studies. It also generalizes across languages. We've tried it with Chinese students, and you get the same effect in Chinese as well. So we tend to have these linguistic biases baked in that I think propagandists and others in the media take advantage of in order to generate ideas that further other particular outgroups, potentially tapping into this mechanism that facilitates violence in intergroup conflict.